I'll be shutting that. Now, some principles of muscle mechanics. So a lot of the last lecture was all, how does muscle contract? You know, we send information through electricity. We eventually, you know, put some calcium where it needs to be, and our muscles shorten, those sarcomeres shorten. Well, some principles of muscle mechanics, kind of like basics of just how muscles work in general. One, anytime we talk about a muscle contracting, that means, you know, anything that happens to a single fiber, a single cell, means it can happen to the whole muscle. If one fiber is shortening, in general, your muscle will shorten as well. Now, contraction, when I'm talking about a muscle contraction, it means it can produce muscle tension. Now, if the force exerted on a load, aka if I'm pushing a book or whatever, or a wall, and a mic, or a desk, if the force exerted on the load or the object is high enough, I can move it. And I'm like, I can put a little bit of force on this table. Is it moving? Nope. And I'm like, it just depends on how much force I put on that. How much of that muscle am I contracting? How much force am I generating to actually move something? I can move that if I want to. Other things I can't. So we're going to be talking about different types of contractions. Now, these will come up a little bit later for isotonic and isometrics. But a contraction, a muscle contraction, does not mean a muscle has to physically shorten. It just generates force. If I push on this table and it's not moving, are my muscles shortening? Nope. And I'm like, however, I'm still generating force. And I'm like, my muscles in theory are still contracting. They're just not shortening. I still have myosin heads grabbing onto the actin, creating cross bridges and generating force. The whole muscle is just not shortening because I'm not actually moving the table. And so we have two different kind of basics of contractions. I want to write it over here because I'm going to leave it up here. We have an isometric and an isotonic. Now, any guess what iso means? Guess? In math, you would use it as like talk about an isosceles triangle. It means equal. There's equal sides. And I'm like, it means equal or the same. So an isometric, metric means length if I'm measuring something in meters. And I'm like, this really means same length. It doesn't shorten, same length. However, the tension changes. An example is the pushing on a table. I don't want to walk all the way over there. And I'm like, my muscles aren't changing length. This is an isometric contraction. My muscles are not changing length. However, I can push a little bit on the table, or I can push really hard on the table. It's still not moving. And I'm like, so I can change the amount of tension, but my length doesn't actually change. That's an isometric contraction. Isotonic, again, iso, so something's the same. This one, we have the same tension, and the length changes. It's like doing the opposite. So the length can change, but the tension is the same. Sorry, sometimes I wish I had a book. Pretend. My folder of papers. It weighs whatever. We'll say a pound. And I'm like, awesome. Is my muscle changing length? So you nod, yes. Yes? Muscle is changing length. Did this change in weight? No. So the tension will be the same on it. And I'm like, so my muscle, and I'm like, is shortening. My muscle is changing length, but the tension is going to stay the same because it's the exact same weight. So that's an isotonic contraction. Now, the force on pushing something, pulling on something, lifting something, whatever it is, and how long you can contract your muscles can depend on different frequencies. How much information is getting sent from the brain, sending information to the muscles to contract, and what is the intensity of the information? What is the intensity of the electricity that's coming to say muscles contract? And I'm like, so how intense that information is going to your muscles can change how much you can lift and how long you can lift it. Same thing with how fast they're coming. And we'll look at these. Now, some basics. Gotta have some basic terms. And I'm like, it's called a motor unit. Yeah, again, anything motor means movement. And I'm like, this is the nerve muscle functional unit. It's kind of like a neuromuscular junction, but we've added a little more to it. So every muscle is served by at least one motor nerve. I can't remember if I have a picture or not. Yeah, there we go. Every muscle is served by at least one motor nerve. Like we have all those nerves, spinal nerves, kind of off the spinal cord. Motor means it's going to go to a muscle, tell it to do something. And every muscle is controlled by at least one motor nerve. I don't know if I'm going to go back and forth or not. Maybe not. And I'm like, now, a motor nerve contains axons of hundreds of motor neurons. A neuron is different than a nerve. If you remember, here's a nerve. It's beautiful, isn't it? In your nerve, you have a whole bunch of these things. What are these? Vesicles. And in it, a whole bunch of these things. What are these things? And they would usually have something around them. I'm not going to draw that all around. What are each of these things? They're the axons of a what? What's that thing? A neuron. There we go. They're an axon. It says a neuron. Those are all axons of a neuron. And so, like kind of your basics, every muscle is controlled by at least one motor nerve that comes off a spinal cord. However, that motor nerve, this is that nerve. There are lots and lots of neurons inside of that nerve. The neurons are inside of a nerve. So when I go back, I'm like, a motor nerve contains axons. Here's my nerve. Contains axons of up to hundreds, I'm not drawing hundreds, of motor neurons. I can just see the axon. Now, at the end of each one of these axons, and there's hundreds of them, at the end of it, it all has axon terminals. Each one is going to be attached to some part of a muscle fiber, and that's your neuromuscular junction. So here's my nerve. That's my one neuron, and it will branch out. I have all of these little tiny axon terminals at the end of it. And yes, it will control several different muscle fibers, several different muscle cells. When I talk about a motor unit, I'm talking about that, my motor unit number 2. It's that neuron and the muscle fibers that it controls. How many muscle fibers or muscle cells is motor unit number 2 controlling? I'll make you count. 3. 1, 2, 3. How many muscle fibers is my motor unit number 1 controlling? 2. And I'm like, so a motor unit is just talking about that neuron and the muscle fibers that it controls. And I'm like, it may be 2, it may be 3, it may be hundreds that one neuron can control. So this is where a motor unit is one neuron and all of the fibers that it controls. It could be, I was going to say, my examples were 2 to 3. They're usually not that small. And I'm like, it's usually somewhere between 4 and several hundred fibers that one neuron can control, because this can branch hundreds of different times. Now, the smaller the number, the finer control you have over a muscle. So I'm like, if you've got one motor unit and it is controlling 100 different things, you don't have the best control over it because it's just branched so many times. If you've got just a few, you've got a little finer control. The finest controlled muscles that we have in our body are our eye muscles that allow us to look in every single direction. And I'm like, we've got really fine control over those. So it might just be 4 muscle fibers. So when I'm talking about a motor unit, one neuron and all the fibers that it controls. Now, some basics of my motor unit. Muscle fibers from a motor unit, whether it's 2 or 3 or whatever on that picture, they usually try to spread out from the muscle. And so are the fibers right next to each other? Are the ones that are in motor unit number 2, the pink ones, are these muscle fibers right next to each other? Nope. Are these muscle fibers right next to each other? Nope. They usually try to spread themselves out through the muscle a little bit. So when that neuron is activated, and it tells those 2 or those 3 muscle fibers to contract, it's not just like, oh, over in this one corner of a muscle it contracts. It makes the muscle contract a little more evenly if they're spread out amongst themselves. Now, motor units in the muscle, example, there's 2 on them, usually contract asynchronously. If you put the letter A at the beginning of something, what does it mean? Without. So without synchrony, they are not in sync. And I'm like, so motor units in one muscle usually do not contract all at the exact same time. It helps prevent fatigue. And so motor unit number 1 may tell these 2 fibers to contract, and they shorten, and then as it's starting to get tired, motor unit number 2 tells its 3 muscle fibers, okay, well, motor unit number 1 fibers are getting tired, so maybe we should start to, contract. It's still all controlling the same muscle. It's just we're activating different muscle fibers to help prevent fatigue and tired. Now, when we talk about muscles contracting, that means one motor unit is responding to one single action potential. Some electricity came from the brain, and am I going to say, okay, we need to contract? The simplest contraction is considered a twitch. And I'm like, it's just one tiny little action potential, and what will actually happen to that muscle with it shortening. Now, and I'm like, we cannot see a muscle twitch. And some of you are like, whatever, I could totally see my muscles twitch. And I'm like, a twitch itself is so negligible. What you are seeing is lots of muscle fibers twitching, not one. And I'm like, but the smallest observable twitch, one tiny little motor unit, and what it controls is recorded in a lab called a myogram. Myo means muscle, is just a record of these muscles contracting in a lab. Now, before muscle can actually contract, even if it's not even visible, there's kind of 3 periods or 3 phases of a muscle contraction or this tiny little twitch. One, there's the latent period. There's a time between when the brain says the muscle should do something, and we have to have acetylcholine moving, calcium moving, tropomyosin moving. We've got all these things that have to move before a muscle can contract, before we can even record it. There's a little latent period in there. Then the muscle will contract. All those myosin cross bridges form. And then you have muscle contraction. All the calcium that made it possible for the muscle to contract, it all goes back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and we go back to normal. So there's kind of 3 phases. We see nothing, but there's stuff happening. And I'm like, then the muscle contracts, and then the muscle relaxes. Now, muscles contract faster than they relax. So this is just looking at time. So we've got some information, action potential that arrived right here. But we don't actually see anything yet happening. Doesn't mean there's not anything happening. Calcium's moving, acetylcholine, lots of things are moving. But we don't see anything. That's your latent period. The muscle contracts, and then it relaxes. It contracts a whole lot faster than it relaxes, which works out well for us. And I'm like, because if you need quick responses for something, we can contract really, really quickly. And it just takes a little bit longer for it to reset itself. Now, the different strength and duration of different muscle twitches varies based on enzymes in the muscles and some metabolic properties. I don't know if we're going to get that far in lecture today. Might be on my thing. But muscle twitches in the lab, and I'm like to actually see muscles twitching all on their own. It's usually a neuromuscular problem. Normally, and I'm like that a muscle would twitch in a lab, that doesn't happen. Our muscles contract smoothly. Even if you start to see muscles twitches, because I've had like my eye twitches or I get a weird twitch, and I'm like, that in itself is not technically considered a twitch. And I'm like, because it's activating several different muscle fibers instead of just like one motor neuron. Normally, to see in a lab muscles twitching, there's some type of neurological problem that muscles are starting to contract tiny little bits everywhere. Normally, our muscles are nice and smooth, and they contract nice and smooth. This is showing how long a muscle twitch can be compared to 3 different muscles. Extraocular muscles, where do you think you find those? Ocular. Eyes. And I'm like, gastrocnemius, where's that? This is like a little lab review too. That's your big calf muscle. Where's the soleus? It's not on the foot. You don't have to know any muscles on the foot. It's the muscle right underneath the gastrocnemius. It runs the entire length of the back of your leg. And I'm like, it's longer. Generally, and I'm like, The bigger the muscle, the slower it takes to contract, and the slower or the longer it takes for it to relax. So your eye muscles, they can contract very, very quickly and then relax very quickly. Your gastrocnemius, your big old thigh muscle if you've got, or not thigh, but your big old calf muscles if you've got them, they can also contract pretty quickly and relax. The larger the muscle is the soleus that runs the entire length of the back of your lower leg. It's a larger muscle. It takes longer for it to contract, and it takes longer for it to relax. Now, some different muscle responses and how your muscle will respond is all based, and I was going to say, we've got different responses. The responses of our muscles to contract are determined by the frequency of stimulation. How fast or how fast are we sending information to our muscles from our brain, and what is the strength of the stimulation? It is a really strong electrical signal or a weak electrical signal. That will determine the strength of your contraction. Now, we're going to look at first the frequency. If we change the frequency in stimulation, this is your basic one stimulus. Muscle contracts, muscle relaxes,